Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 4. Tales of Power. Part 2. The Tonal and the Nagual. The Wings of Perception. Don Juan and I spent the whole day in the mountains. We left at dawn. He took me to 4 places of power, and at each one of them, he gave me specific instructions on how to proceed towards the fulfillment of the particular task that he had outlined years before as a life situation for me. We returned in the late afternoon. After eating, Don Juan left Don Genero's house. He told me that I had to wait for Pablito, who was bringing some kerosene for the lantern, and that I should talk to him. I became utterly absorbed in working on my notes and did not hear Pablito come in until he was next to me. Pablito's comment was that he had been practicing the gate of power, and because of that I could not possibly have heard him unless I was capable of seeing. I had always liked Pablito. I had not, however, had very many opportunities in the past to be alone with him, although we were good friends. Pablito had always struck me as being a most charming person. His name, of course, was Pablo, but the diminutive, Pablito, suited him better. He was small-boned but wiry. Like Don Genero, he was lean, unsuspectedly muscular, and strong. He was perhaps in his late 20s, but it seemed like he was 18. He was dark and of medium height. His brown eyes were clear and bright, and like Don Genero, he had a winning smile with a touch of devilishness in it. I asked him about his friend Nestor, Don Genero's other apprentice. In the past I had always seen them together, and they had always given me the impression of having an excellent rapport with each other, yet they were opposites in physical appearance and character. While Pablito was jovial and frank, Nestor was gloomy and withdrawn. He was also taller, heavier, darker, and much older. Pablito said that Nestor had finally become involved in his work with Don Genero, and that he had changed into an altogether different person since the last time I had seen him. He did not want to elaborate any further on Nestor's work or change of personality, and abruptly shifted the topic of conversation. "I understand the Nagual is biting your heels," he said. I was surprised that he knew, and I asked how he had found that out. "Genero tells me everything," he said. I noticed that he did not speak of Don Genero in the same formal way I did. He simply called him Genero in a familiar fashion. He said that Don Genero was like his brother, and that they were at ease around each other, as though they were family. He openly professed that he loved Don Genero dearly. I was deeply moved by his simplicity and candor. In talking to him, I realized how close in temperament Don Juan and I were, thus our relationship was formal and strict in comparison to Don Genero and Pablito's. I asked Pablito why he was afraid of Don Juan. His eyes flickered. It was as if the mere thought of Don Juan made him wince. He did not answer. He seemed to be assessing me in some mysterious way. "You're not afraid of him?" he asked. I told him I was afraid of Don Genero, and he laughed as if that were the last thing he expected to hear. He said that the difference between Don Juan and Don Genero was like the difference between day and night. Don Genero was the day, Don Juan was the night, and as such he was the most frightening being on earth. Describing his fear for Don Juan led Pablito to make some comments about his own condition as an apprentice. "I'm in a most miserable state," he said. If you could see what's in my house, you would realize that I know too much for an ordinary man. And yet if you saw me with the Nagual, you would realize that I don't know enough." He quickly changed the subject and began to laugh at my taking notes. He said that Don Gennaro had provided hours of fun imitating me. He added that Don Gennaro liked me very much, in spite of the oddities of my person, and that he had expressed his delight in my being his protegito. This was the first time I had heard that term. It was congruous with another term introduced by Don Juan at the beginning of our association. He had told me that I was his escogido, the chosen one. The word protegito meant the protected one. I asked Pablito about his meetings with the Nagual, and he told me the story of his first encounter with it. He said that once Don Juan gave him a basket, which he took to be a gift of goodwill. He placed it on a hook over the door of his room, and since he could not conceive any use for it at that moment, he forgot about it all day. He said that his idea was that the basket was a gift of power and had to be put to use with something very special. During the early evening, which Pablito said was his deadly hour also, he walked into his room to get his jacket. He was alone in the house and was getting ready to go visit a friend. The room was dark. He grabbed the jacket, and when he was about to reach the door, the basket fell in front of him and rolled near his feet. Pablito said that he laughed his fright away as soon as he saw that it had only been the basket that had fallen from the hook. He leaned over to pick it up and got the jolt of his life. The basket jumped out of his reach and began to shake and squeak, as if someone were twisting and pressing down on it. Pablito said that there was enough light coming from the kitchen to clearly distinguish everything in the room. He stared at the basket for a moment, although he felt he should not do that. The basket began to convulse in the midst of some heavy, rasping and difficult breathing. Pablito maintained, in recounting his experience, that he actually saw and heard the basket breathing, and that it was alive and chased him around the room, blocking his exit. He said that the basket then began to swell. All the strips of bamboo came loose and turned into a giant ball, like a dry tumbleweed that rolled towards him. He fell backwards on the floor, and the ball began to crawl onto his feet. Pablito said that by that time he was out of his mind, screaming hysterically. The ball had him trapped and moved on his legs like pins going through him. He tried to push it away, and then noticed that the ball was the face of Don Juan with his mouth open, ready to devour him. At that point he could not stand the terror and lost consciousness. Pablito, in a very frank and open manner, told me a series of terrifying encounters that he and other members of his household had had with the Nagual. We spent hours talking. He seemed to be in very much the same quandary that I was in, but was definitely more sensitive than I in handling himself within the sorcerer's frame of reference. At one moment he got up and said that he felt Don Juan was coming and did not want to be found there. He took off with incredible speed. It was as if something had pulled him out of the room. He left me in the middle of saying goodbye. Don Juan and Don Gennaro came back shortly. They were laughing. Pablito was running down the road like a soul chased by the devil, Don Juan said. I wonder why? I think he got frightened when he saw Carlitos working his fingers to the bone, Don Gennaro said, mocking my writing. He came closer to me. Hey. I've got an idea, he said almost in a whisper. Since you like to write so much, why don't you learn to write with your finger instead of a pencil? That'll be a blast. Don Juan and Don Genaro sat by my side and laughed while they speculated about the possibility of writing with one's finger. Don Juan, in a serious tone, made a strange comment. He said, "There is no doubt that he could write with his finger, but would he be able to read it?" Don Genaro doubled up with laughter and added, "I am confident that he can read anything." And then he began to tell a most disconcerting tale about a country bumpkin who became an important official during a time of political upheaval. Don Genaro said that the hero of his story was appointed minister, or governor, or perhaps even president, because there was no way of telling what people would do in their folly. Because of this appointment, he came to believe that he was indeed important and learned to put on an act. Don Genaro paused and examined me with the air of a ham actor overplaying his part. He winked at me and moved his eyebrows up and down. He said that the hero of the story was very good at public appearances and could whip up a speech with no difficulty at all, but that his position required that he read his speeches, and the man was illiterate. So he used his wits to outsmart everybody. He had a sheet of paper with something written on it and flashed it around whenever he gave a speech. And thus his efficiency and other good qualities were undeniable to all the country bumpkins. But one day a literate stranger came along and noticed that the hero was reading his speech while holding the sheet upside down. He began to laugh and pointed out the light at everyone. Don Genaro again paused for a moment and looked at me, squinting his eyes, and asked, "Do you think that the hero was caught?" "Not a chance." He faced everyone calmly and said, "Upside down? Why should the position of the sheet matter if you know how to read?" And the bumpkins agreed with him. Don Juan and Don Genaro both exploded into laughter. Don Genaro patted me gently on the back. It was as if I were the hero of the story. I felt embarrassed and laughed nervously. I thought that perhaps there was a hidden meaning to it, but I did not dare ask. Don Juan moved closer to me. He leaned over and whispered in my right ear, "Don't you think it's funny?" Don Genaro also leaned over towards me and whispered in my left ear. What did he say? I had an automatic reaction to both questions and made an involuntary synthesis. Yes. I thought he asked it's funny, I said. They were obviously aware of the effect of their maneuvers. They laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. Don Genaro, as usual, was more exaggerated than Don Juan. He fell backwards and rolled on his back a few yards away from me. He lay on his stomach, extending his arms and legs out, and whirled around on the ground, as though he were lying on a swivel. He whirled until he got close to me and his foot touched mine. He sat up abruptly and smiled sheepishly. Don Juan was holding his sides. He was laughing very hard, and it seemed that his stomach hurt. After a while they both leaned over and kept on whispering into my ears. I tried to memorize the sequence of their utterances, but after a futile effort I gave up. There were too many. The next sensation I could recollect with clarity was a wave of wonder and exultation. All of me vibrated. It was as if charges of electricity were going through me. They were not painful. They were pleasing, but in such an undetermined form that there was no way of categorizing them. I knew, nevertheless, that whatever I was in contact with was the ground. Some part of me acknowledged with concise certainty that it was the ground. But the instant I tried to discern the infinitude of direct perceptions I was having, I lost all capacity to differentiate my perceptions. Then all of a sudden I was myself again. I was thinking. It was such an abrupt transition that I thought I had woken up. Yet there was something in the way I felt that was not quite myself. I knew that there was indeed something missing before I fully opened my eyes. I looked around. I was still in a dream, or having a vision of some sort. My thought processes, however, were not only unimpaired but extraordinarily clear. I made a quick assessment. I had no doubt that Don Juan and Don Gennaro had induced my dreamlike state for a specific purpose. I seemed to be on the verge of understanding what that purpose was when something extraneous to me forced me to pay attention to my surroundings. It took me a long moment to orient myself. I was actually lying on my stomach, and what I was lying on was a most spectacular floor. As I examined it, I could not avoid a feeling of awe and wonder. I could not conceive what it was made of. Irregular slabs of some unknown substance had been placed in a most intricate yet simple fashion. They had been put together but were not stuck to the ground or to each other. They were elastic and gave when I attempted to pry them apart with my fingers, but once I released the tension they went right back to their original position. I tried to get up and was seized by the most outlandish sensory distortion. I had no control over my body. In fact, my body did not seem to be my own. It was inert. I had no connection to any of its parts, and when I tried to stand up I could not move my arms, and I wobbled helplessly on my stomach, rolling on my side. The momentum of my wobbling almost made me do a complete turn onto my stomach again. My outstretched arms and legs prevented me from turning over, and I came to rest on my back. In that position I caught a glimpse of two strangely shaped legs, and the most distorted feet I had ever seen. It was my body. I seemed to be wrapped up in a tunic. The thought that came to my mind was that I was experiencing a scene of myself as a cripple or an invalid of some sort. I tried to curve my back and look at my legs, but I could only jerk my body. I was looking directly at a yellow sky, a deep, rich lemon yellow sky. It had grooves or canals of a deeper yellow tone, and an endless number of protuberances that hung like drops of water. The total effect of that incredible sky was staggering. I could not determine if the protuberances were clouds. There were also areas of shadows and areas of different tones of yellow which I discovered as I moved my head from side to side. Then something else attracted my attention. A sun at the very zenith of the yellow sky, right over my head, a mild sun, judging by the fact that I could stare into it, that cast a soothing, uniform whitish light. Before I had had time to ponder upon all these unearthly sights, I was violently shaken. My head jerked and bobbed back and forth. I felt I was being lifted. I heard a shrill voice and giggling, and I was confronted by a most astounding sight. A giant barefoot female. Her face was round and enormous. Her black hair was cut in pageboy fashion. Her arms and legs were gigantic. She picked me up and lifted me to her shoulders as if I were a doll. My body hung limp. I was looking down her strong back. She had a fine fuzz around her shoulders and down her spine. Looking down from her shoulder, I saw the magnificent floor again. I could hear it giving elastically under her enormous weight, and I could see the pressure marks that her feet left on it. She put me down on my stomach in front of a structure, some sort of building. I noticed then that there was something wrong with my depth perception. I could not figure out the size of the building by looking at it. At moments it seemed ridiculously small, But then after I seemingly adjusted my perception, I truly marveled at its monumental proportions. The giant girl sat next to me and made the floor squeak. I was touching her enormous knee. She smelled like candy or strawberries. She talked to me and I understood everything she said. Pointing to the structure, she told me that I was going to live there. My prowess of observation seemed to increase as I got over the initial shock of finding myself there. I noticed then that the building had 4 exquisite dysfunctional columns. They did not support anything. They were on top of the building. Their shape was simplicity itself. They were long and graceful projections that seemed to be reaching for that awesome, incredibly yellow sky. The effect of those inverted columns was sheer beauty to me. I had a seizure of aesthetic rapture. The columns seemed to have been made in one piece. I could not even conceive how. The 2 columns in front were joined by a slender beam, a monumentally long rod that I thought may have served as a railing of some sort, or a veranda overlooking the front. The giant girl made me slide on my back into the structure. The roof was black and flat, and was covered with symmetric holes that let the yellowish glare of the sky show through, creating the most intricate patterns. I was truly awed with the utter simplicity and beauty that had been achieved by those dots of yellow sky showing through those precise holes in the roof, and the patterns of shadows that they created on that magnificent and intricate floor. The structure was square, and outside of its poignant beauty it was incomprehensible to me. My state of exultation was so intense at that moment that I wanted to weep or stay there forever. But some force or tension or something undefinable began to pull me. Suddenly I found myself out of the structure, still lying on my back. The giant girl was there, but there was another being with her, a woman so big that she reached to the sky and eclipsed the sun. Compared to her, the giant girl was just a little girl. The big woman was angry. She grabbed the structure by one of its columns, lifted it up, turned it upside down, and set it on the floor. It was a chair. That realization was like a catalyst. It triggered some overwhelming perceptions. I went through a series of images that were disconnected, but could be made to stand as a sequence. In successive flashes I saw or realized that the magnificent and incomprehensible floor was a straw mat. The yellow sky was the stucco ceiling of a room. The sun was a light bulb. The structure that had evoked such rapture in me was a chair that a child had turned upside down to play house. I had one more coherent and sequential vision of another mysterious architectural structure of monumental proportions. It stood by itself. It looked almost like a shell of a pointed snail standing with its tail up. The walls were made of concave and convex plates of some strange purple material. Each plate had grooves that seemed more functional than ornamental. I examined the structure meticulously and in detail, and found that it was, like in the case of the previous one, thoroughly incomprehensible. I expected to suddenly adjust my perception to disclose the true nature of the structure. But nothing of the sort happened. I then had a conglomerate of alien and inextricable awarenesses, or findings, about the building and its function, which did not make sense, because I had no frame of reference for them. I regained my normal awareness all of a sudden. Don Juan and Don Gennaro were next to me. I was tired. I looked for my watch, it was gone. Don Juan and Don Gennaro giggled in unison. Don Juan said that I should not worry about time, and that I should concentrate on following certain recommendations that Don Gennaro had made to me. I turned to Don Gennaro and he made a joke. He said that the most important recommendation was that I should learn to write with my finger, to save on pencils and to show off. They teased me about my notes for a while longer, and then I went to sleep. Don Juan and Don Gennaro listened to the detailed account of my experience, which I gave them at Don Juan's request after I woke up the next day. Gennaro feels that you've got enough for the time being, Don Juan said after I finished talking. Don Gennaro assented with a nod. What was the meaning of what I experienced last night? I asked. You caught a glimpse of the most important issue of sorcery, Don Juan said. Last night you peeked into the totality of yourself. But that's of course a meaningless statement for you at this moment. Obviously, arriving at the totality of oneself is not a matter of one's desire to agree or of one's willingness to learn. Gennaro thinks that your body needs time to let the whispering of the Nagual sink into you. Don Gennaro nodded again. Plenty of time, he said, shaking his head up and down. 20 or 30 years perhaps. I did not know how to react. I looked at Don Juan for clues. They both had serious expressions. Do I really have 20 or 30 years? I asked. Of course not. Don Gennaro yelled and they broke into laughter. Don Juan said that I should return whenever my inner voice told me to, and that in the meantime, I should try to assemble all the suggestions that they had made while I was split. How do I do that? I asked. By turning off your internal dialogue and letting something in you flow out and expand, Don Juan said. That something is your perception, but don't try to figure out what I mean. Just let the whispering of the Nagual guide you. Then he said that the night before I had had two sets of intrinsically different views. One was inexplicable, the other was perfectly natural, and the order in which they had happened pointed to a condition that was intrinsic to all of us. One view was the Nagual, the other the tonal, Don Gennaro added. I wanted him to explain his statement. He looked at me and patted me on the back. Don Juan stepped in and said that the first two views were the Nagual, and that Don Gennaro had selected a tree and the ground as the points for emphasis. The other two were views of the tonal that he himself had selected. One of them was my perception of the world as an infant. It appeared to be an alien world to you, because your perception had not been trimmed yet to fit the desired mold, he said. Was that the way I really saw the world? I asked. Certainly, he said. That was your memory. I asked Don Juan whether the feeling of aesthetic appreciation that had enraptured me was also part of my memory. We go into those views as we are today, he said. You were seeing that scene as you would see it now. Yet the exercise was one of perception. That was the scene of a time when the world became for you what it is now. A time when a chair became a chair. He did not want to discuss the other scene. That wasn't a memory of my childhood, I said. That's right, he said. It was something else. Was it something I will see in the future? I asked. There's no future. He exclaimed cuttingly. The future is only a way of talking. For a sorcerer there is only the here and now. He said that there was essentially nothing to say about it, because the purpose of the exercise had been to open the wings of my perception, and that although I had not flown on those wings, I had nonetheless touched 4 points, which would be inconceivable to reach from the point of view of my ordinary perception. I began to gather my things to leave. Don Gennaro helped me pack my notebook. He put it in the bottom of my briefcase. "It'll be warm and cozy there," he said and winked. "You can rest assured that it won't catch cold." Then Don Juan seemed to change his mind about my leaving and started to talk about my experience. I automatically tried to grab my briefcase from Don Gennaro's hands, but he dropped it to the floor before I touched it. Don Juan was talking with his back turned to me. I scooped up the briefcase and hurriedly searched for my notebook. Don Gennaro had really packed it so tightly that I had a hellish time getting to it. Finally, I took it out and began to write. Don Juan and Don Gennaro were staring at me. "You're in terrible shape," Don Juan said, laughing. "You reach for your notebook as a drunkard reaches for the bottle." "As a loving mother reaches for her child," Don Gennaro snapped. "As a priest reaches for his crucifix," Don Juan added. "As a woman reaches for her panties," Don Gennaro yelled. They went on and on, presenting similes and howling with laughter as they walked me to my car. Part 3. The Sorcerer's Explanation. 3 Witnesses to the Nagual. Upon returning home, I was faced again with the task of organizing my field notes. What Don Juan and Don Gennaro had made me experience became all the more poignant as I recapitulated the events. I noticed, however, that my usual reaction of indulging for months in bewilderment and awe over what I had gone through was not as intense as it had been in the past. Various times, I deliberately attempted to engage my feelings, as I had done before, in speculation and even in self-pity, but something was missing. I had also had the intention of writing down a number of questions to ask Don Juan, Don Gennaro, or even Pablito. The project failed before I had begun it. There was something in me that prevented my entering into a mood of inquiry or perplexity. I did not purposely seek to go back to Don Juan and Don Gennaro, but neither did I shy away from the possibility. One day, however, without any premeditation on my part, I simply felt that it was time to see them. In the past, every time I was about to leave for Mexico, I had always had the feeling that there were thousands of important and pressing questions that I wanted to ask Don Juan. This time there was nothing on my mind. It was as if after I had worked over my notes, I had become emptied of the past and ready for the here and now of Don Juan and Don Gennaro's world. I had to wait only a few hours before Don Juan found me in the market of a little town in the mountains of central Mexico. He greeted me with utmost affection and made a casual suggestion. He said that before we arrived at Don Gennaro's place, he would like to pay a visit to Don Gennaro's apprentices, Pablito and Nestor. As I turned off the highway, he told me to keep a close watch for any unusual sight on the side of the road or on the road itself. I asked him to give me more precise clues about what he had in mind. "I can't," he said. "The Nagual doesn't need precise clues." I slowed the car down in an automatic response to his reply. He laughed loudly and signaled me with a movement of his hand to keep on driving. As we approached the town where Pablito and Nestor lived, Don Juan told me to stop my car. He moved his chin imperceptibly and pointed to a group of medium-sized boulders on the left side of the road. "There's the Nagual," he said in a whisper. There was no one around. I had expected to see Don Gennaro. I looked at the boulders again, and then I scanned the area around them. There was nothing in sight. I strained my eyes to distinguish anything: a small animal, an insect, a shadow, a strange formation of the rocks, anything unusual. I gave up after a moment and turned to face Don Juan. He held my questioning gaze without smiling, and then gently pushed my arm with the back of his hand to make me look at the boulders again. I stared at them, then Don Juan got out of the car and told me to follow him and examine them. We walked slowly on a gentle slope for about 60 or 70 yards to the base of the rocks. He stood there for a moment and whispered in my right ear that the Nagual was waiting for me right at that place. I told him that no matter how hard I tried, all I could distinguish were the rocks and a few tufts of weeds and some cactuses. He insisted, however, that the Nagual was there, waiting for me. He ordered me to sit down, turn off my internal dialogue, and keep my unfocused eyes on the top of the boulders. He sat by me and, putting his mouth to my right ear, whispered that the Nagual had seen me, that it was there although I could not visualize it, and that my problem was merely one of not being capable of completely shutting off my internal dialogue. I heard every word he said in a state of inner silence. I understood everything, yet I was incapable of answering. The effort needed to think and talk would have been impossible. My reactions to his comments were not thoughts proper, but rather complete units of feeling, which had all the innuendos of meaning that I usually associate with thinking. He whispered that it was very difficult to start by oneself on the path towards the Nagual, and that I was indeed most fortunate to have been launched by the moth and its song. He said that by holding the memory of the moth's call, I could bring it back to aid me. His words were either an overpowering suggestion, or perhaps I summoned that perceptual phenomenon he called the moth's call, for no sooner had he whispered his words to me than the extraordinary sputtering sound became audible. Its richness of tone made me feel as if I were inside an echo chamber. As the sound grew in loudness or proximity, I also detected, in a dreamlike state, that something was moving on top of the boulders. The movement frightened me so intensely that I immediately regained my crystal clear awareness. My eyes focused on the boulders. Don Juan was sitting on top of one of them. His feet were dangling, and with the heels of his shoes he was hammering the rock, producing a rhythmical sound that seemed to be synchronized with the moth's call. He smiled and waved his hand at me. I wanted to think rationally. I had the feeling, the desire to figure out how he got there, or how I saw him there, but I could not involve my reason at all. All I could do, under the circumstances, was to look at him while he sat smiling, waving his hand. After a moment he seemed to get ready to slide down the round boulder. I saw him stiffening his legs, preparing his feet for landing on the hard ground, and arching his back until he almost touched the surface of the rock in order to gain sliding momentum. But in the middle of his descent his body stopped. I had the impression he got stuck. He kicked a couple of times with both legs as if he were floating in water. He seemed to be trying to get loose from something that had trapped him by the seat of his pants. He rubbed the sides of his buttocks frantically with both hands. He actually gave me the impression of being painfully caught. I wanted to run to him and aid him, but Don Juan held my arm. I heard him say to me, half choking with laughter, "Watch him. Watch him." Don Juan kicked, contorted his body and wiggled from side to side, as if he were loosening a nail. Then I heard a loud pop, and he glided, or was hurled, to where Don Juan and I were standing. He landed 4 or 5 feet in front of me, on his feet. He rubbed his buttocks and jumped up and down in a dance of pain, yelling profanities. The rock didn't want to let me go and grabbed me by the ass, he said to me in a sheepish tone. I experienced a sensation of unequal joy. I laughed loudly. I noticed that my mirth was equal to my clarity of mind. I was engulfed at that moment in an overall state of great awareness. Everything around me was crystal clear. I had been drowsy or absent-minded before because of my inner silence. But then something in Don Gennaro's sudden appearance had created a state of great lucidity. Don Gennaro kept on rubbing his buttocks and jumping up and down for a while longer. Then he limped to my car, opened the door and crawled into the back seat. I automatically turned around to talk to Don Juan. He was not anywhere in sight. I started to call him out loud. Don Gennaro got out of the car and began to run around in circles, also calling Don Juan's name in a shrill, frantic tone. It was only then, as I watched him, that I realized he was mimicking me. I had had an attack of such an intense fear upon finding myself alone with Don Gennaro that I had run around the car 3 or 4 times in quite an unconscious manner, yelling Don Juan's name. Don Gennaro said that we had to pick up Pablito and Nestor, and that Don Juan would be waiting for us somewhere along the way. After I had overcome my initial fright, I told him that I was glad to see him. He teased me about my reaction. He said that Don Juan was not like a father to me, but rather like a mother. He made some remarks and puns about mothers that were utterly funny. I was laughing so hard that I did not notice that we had arrived at Pablito's house. Don Gennaro told me to stop and he got out of the car. Pablito was standing by the door of his house. He came running and got in the car and sat next to me in the front. "Let's go to Nestor's place," he said as if he were in a hurry. I turned to look for Don Gennaro. He was not around. Pablito urged me in a pleading voice to hurry. We drove up to Nestor's house. He was also waiting by the door. We got out of the car. I had the feeling that the two of them knew what was going on. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Didn't Gennaro tell you?" Pablito asked me with a tone of incredulity. I assured them that neither Don Juan nor Don Gennaro had mentioned anything to me. "We're going to a power place," Pablito said. "What are we going to do there?" I asked. They both said in unison that they did not know. Nestor added that Don Gennaro had told him to guide me to the place. "Did you come from Gennaro's house?" Pablito asked. I mentioned that I had been with Don Juan, and that we had found Don Gennaro on the way, and that Don Juan had left me with him. "Where did Don Gennaro go?" I asked Pablito. But Pablito did not know what I was talking about. He had not seen Don Gennaro in my car. "He drove with me to your house," I said. "I think you had the Nagual in your car," Nestor said in a frightened tone. He did not want to sit in the back and crammed next to Pablito in the front. We drove in silence, except for Nestor's short commands to show the way. I wanted to think about the events of that morning, but somehow I knew that any attempt to explain them was a fruitless indulging on my part. I tried to engage Nestor and Pablito in a conversation. They said that they were too nervous inside the car and could not talk. I enjoyed their candid reply and did not press them any further. After more than an hour's drive, we parked the car on a side road and climbed up the side of a steep mountain. We walked in silence for another hour or so, with Nestor in the lead, and then we stopped at the bottom of a huge cliff, which was perhaps over 200 feet high with a nearly vertical drop. With half-closed eyes Nestor scanned the ground, looking for a proper place to sit. I was painfully aware that he was clumsy in his scanning movements. Pablito, who was next to me, seemed at various times to be on the verge of stepping in and correcting him, but he restrained himself and relaxed. Then Nestor selected a place, after a moment's hesitation. Pablito sighed with relief. I knew that the place Nestor had selected was the proper one, but I could not figure out how I knew that. Thus I involved myself in the pseudo-problem of imagining what place I would have selected myself if I had been leading them. I could not, however, even begin to speculate on the procedure I would have followed. Pablito was obviously aware of what I was doing. "You can't do that," he whispered to me. I laughed with embarrassment, as if he had caught me doing something illicit. Pablito laughed and said that Don Genaro always walked around in the mountains with both of them and gave each of them the lead from time to time, so he knew that there was no way of imagining what would have been one's choice. Genaro says that the reason why there is no way to do that is because there are only right and wrong choices, he said. If you make a wrong choice, your body knows it, and so does the body of everyone else. But if you make a right choice, the body knows that and relaxes and forgets right away that there was a choice. You reload your body, see, like a gun, for the next choice. If you want to use your body again for making the same choice, it doesn't work. Nestor looked at me. He was apparently curious about my taking notes. He nodded affirmatively as if agreeing with Pablito, and then smiled for the first time. Two of his upper teeth were crooked. Pablito explained that Nestor was not mean or morbid but embarrassed by his teeth, and that was the reason he never smiled. Nestor laughed, covering his mouth. I told him that I could send him to a dentist to have his teeth straightened. They thought that my suggestion was a joke and laughed like two children. Genaro says that he has to overcome the feeling of shame by himself, Pablito said. Besides, Genaro says that he's lucky. While everyone else bites the same way, Nestor can split a bone lengthwise with his strong crooked teeth, and he can bite a hole through your finger like a nail. Nestor opened his mouth and showed me his teeth. The left incisor and the canine had grown in sideways. He made his teeth clatter by biting on them and growled like a dog. He made 2 or 3 mock advances towards me. Pablito laughed. I had never seen Nestor so light. The few times I had been with him in the past, he had given me the impression of being a middle-aged man. As he sat there smiling with his crooked teeth, I marveled at his youthful appearance. He looked like a young man in his early 20s. Pablito again read my thoughts to perfection. He's losing his self-importance, he said. That's why he's younger. Nestor nodded affirmatively, and without saying a word he let out a very loud fart. I was startled and dropped my pencil. Pablito and Nestor nearly died laughing. When they had calmed down, Nestor came to my side and showed me a homemade contraption that made a peculiar sound when squeezed with the hand. He explained that Don Genaro had showed him how to make it. It had a minute bellows, and the vibrator could be any kind of leaf that was placed in a slit between the 2 pieces of wood that were the compressors. Nestor said that the kind of sound it produced depended on the type of leaf that one used as a vibrator. He wanted me to try it and showed me how to squeeze the compressors to produce a certain type of sound, and how to open them in order to produce another. What do you use it for? I asked. They both exchanged a glance. That's his spirit catcher, you fool, Pablito said cuttingly. His tone was peevish, but his smile was friendly. They were both such a strange, unnerving mixture of Don Gennaro and Don Juan. I became absorbed in a horrible thought. Were Don Juan and Don Gennaro playing tricks on me? I had a moment of supreme terror. But something snapped inside of my stomach and I instantly became calm again. I knew that Pablito and Nestor were using Don Gennaro and Don Juan as models for behavior. I myself had found that I also was behaving more and more like them. Pablito said that Nestor was lucky to have a spirit catcher and that he did not have one himself. "What shall we do here?" I asked Pablito. Nestor answered as if I had addressed the question to him. "Gennaro told me that we have to wait here, and while we wait we should laugh and enjoy ourselves," he said. "How long do you think we have to wait?" I asked. He did not answer. He shook his head and looked at Pablito as if asking him. "I have no idea," Pablito said. We got involved then in a lively conversation about Pablito's sisters. Nestor teased him that his oldest sister had such a mean look that she could kill lice with her eyes. He said that Pablito was afraid of her because she was so strong that once in a fit of anger, she plucked a handful of his hair as if it were chicken feathers. Pablito conceded that his oldest sister had been a beast, but that the Nagual had fixed her and brought her into line. After he had told me the story of how she was made to behave, I realized that Pablito and Nestor never mentioned Don Juan's name, but referred to him as the Nagual. Apparently Don Juan had intervened in Pablito's life and coerced all his sisters into leading a more harmonious life. Pablito said that after the Nagual was through with them they were like saints. Nestor wanted to know what I did with my notes. I explained my work to them. I had the weird sensation that they were genuinely interested in what I was saying, and I ended up talking about anthropology and philosophy. I felt ludicrous and wanted to stop, but I found myself immersed in my elucidation and unable to cut it short. I had the unsettling sensation that both of them as a team were somehow forcing me into that lengthy explanation. Their eyes were fixed on me. They did not seem to be bored or tired. I was in the middle of a comment when I heard the faint sound of the moth's call. My body stiffened and I never finished my sentence. "The Nagual is here," I said automatically. Nestor and Pablito exchanged a look that I thought was sheer terror and jumped to my side and flanked me. Their mouths were open. They looked like frightened children. I had an inconceivable sensory experience then. My left ear began to move. I felt it sort of wiggling by itself. It practically turned my head in a half circle until I was facing what I thought to be the east. My head tilted slightly to the right. In that position I was capable of detecting the rich sputtering sound of the moth's call. It sounded as if it were far away, coming from the northeast. Once I had established the direction, my ear picked up an incredible amount of sounds. I had no way of knowing, however, whether they were memories of sounds I had heard before or actual sounds which were being produced then. The place where we were was the rugged west slope of a mountain range. Towards the northeast there were groves of trees and patches of mountain shrubs. My ear seemed to pick up the sound of something heavy moving over rocks, coming from that direction. Nestor and Pablito were either responding to my actions, or they themselves were hearing the same sounds. I would have liked to ask them, but I did not dare, or perhaps I was incapable of interrupting my concentration. Nestor and Pablito huddled against me, by my sides, when the sound became louder and closer. Nestor seemed to be the one who was most affected by it. His body shivered uncontrollably. At one moment my left arm began to shake. It raised without my volition until it was almost level with my face, and then it pointed to an area of shrubs. I heard a vibratory sound or a roar. It was a familiar sound to me. I had heard it many years before under the influence of a psychotropic plant. I detected in the shrubs a gigantic black shape. It was as if the shrubs themselves were becoming darker by degrees until they had changed into an ominous blackness. It had no definite form, but it moved. It seemed to breathe. I heard a chilling scream, which was mixed with the yells of terror of Pablito and Nestor, and the shrubs, or the black shape into which they had turned, flew up towards us. I could not maintain my equanimity. Somehow something in me faltered. The shape first hovered over us, and then engulfed us. The light around us became opaque. It was as if the sun had set, or as if all of a sudden it had become twilight. I felt Nestor and Pablito's heads under my armpits. I brought my arms down over their heads in an unconscious protective movement, and I fell, spinning backwards. I did not reach the rocky ground, however. For an instant later I found myself standing up flanked by Pablito and Nestor. Both of them, although taller than I, seemed to have shriveled. By arching their legs and backs, they were actually shorter than I, and fit under my arms. Don Juan and Don Genaro were standing in front of us. Don Genero's eyes glittered like the eyes of a cat at night. Don Juan's eyes had the same glow. I had never seen Don Juan look that way. He was truly awesome. More so than Don Genaro. He seemed younger and stronger than usual. Looking at both of them, I had the maddening feeling that they were not men like myself. Pablito and Nestor whined quietly. Then Don Genaro said that we were the picture of the Trinity. I was the Father, Pablito was the Son, and Nestor the Holy Ghost. Don Juan and Don Genaro laughed in a booming tone. Pablito and Nestor smiled meekly. Don Genaro said that we had to disentangle ourselves because embraces were permissible only between men and women, or between a man and his burro. I realized then that I was standing on the same spot I had been before, and that obviously I had not spun backwards as I thought I had. In fact, Nestor and Pablito were also on the same spot they had been on. Don Genaro signaled Pablito and Nestor with a movement of his head. Don Juan signaled me to follow them. Nestor took the lead and pointed out a sitting place for me and another one for Pablito. We sat in a straight line, about 50 yards from the place where Don Juan and Don Genaro stood motionless at the base of the cliff. As I kept on staring at them, my eyes went involuntarily out of focus. I knew I had definitely crossed them, because I was seeing 4 of them. Then my left eye image of Don Juan became superimposed on the right eye image of Don Genaro. The result of the merger was that I saw an iridescent being standing in between Don Juan and Don Genaro. It was not a man as I ordinarily see men. It was rather a ball of white fire, something like fibers of light covered it. I shook my head. The double image was dispelled, and yet the sight of Don Juan and Don Genaro as luminous beings persisted. I was seeing 2 strange elongated luminous objects. They looked like white iridescent footballs with fibers that had a light of their own. The 2 luminous beings shivered. I actually saw their fibers shaking, and then they whizzed out of sight. They were pulled up by a long filament, a cobweb that seemed to shoot out from the top of the cliff. The sensation I had was that a long beam of light or a luminous line had dropped from the rock and lifted them up. I perceived the sequence with my eyes and with my body. I was also capable of noticing enormous disparities in my mode of perceiving, but I was incapable of speculating about them as I would have ordinarily done. Thus, I was aware that I was looking straight at the base of the cliff, and yet I was seeing Don Juan and Don Genaro on the top, as if I had tilted my head up 45 degrees. I wanted to feel afraid, perhaps to cover my face and weep, or do something else within my normal range of responses. But I seemed to be locked. My desires were not thoughts, as I know thoughts, therefore they could not evoke the emotional response I was accustomed to eliciting in myself. Don Juan and Don Genaro plunged to the ground. I felt that they had done so, judging by the consuming feeling of falling that I experienced in my stomach. Don Genaro remained where he had landed, but Don Juan walked towards us and sat down, behind me, to my right. Nestor was in a crouching position, his legs tucked in against his stomach. He was resting his chin on his cupped palms. His forearms served as supports by being propped against his thighs. Pablito was sitting with his body slightly bent forward, holding his hands against his stomach. I noticed then that I had placed my forearms across my umbilical region, and I was holding myself by the skin on my sides. I had grabbed myself so hard that my sides ached. Don Juan spoke in a dry murmur, addressing all of us. "You must fix your gaze on the Nagual," he said. "All thoughts and words must be washed away." He repeated it 5 or 6 times. His voice was strange, unknown to me. It gave me the actual feeling of the scales on the skin of a lizard. That simile was a feeling, not a conscious thought. Each of his words peeled, like scales. There was such an eerie rhythm to them. They were muffled, dry, like soft coughing, a rhythmical murmur made into a command. Don Genaro stood motionless. As I stared at him, I could not keep my image conversion, and my eyes crossed involuntarily. In that state, I noticed again a strange luminosity in Don Genaro's body. My eyes were beginning to close, or to tear. Don Juan came to my rescue. I heard him giving a command not to cross the eyes. I felt a soft tap on my head. He had apparently hit me with a pebble. I saw the pebble bounce a couple of times on the rocks near me. He must have also hit Nestor and Pablito. I heard the sound of other pebbles as they bounced on the rocks. Don Genaro adopted a strange dancing posture. His knees were bent, his arms were extended to his sides, his fingers outstretched. He seemed to be about to twirl. In fact, he half whirled around, and then he was pulled up. I had the clear perception that he had been hoisted up by the line of a giant caterpillar that lifted his body to the very top of the cliff. My perception of the upward movement was a most weird mixture of visual and bodily sensations. I half saw and half felt his flight to the top. There was something that looked or felt like a line or an almost imperceptible thread of light pulling him up. I did not see his flight upward in the sense I would follow a bird in flight with my eyes. There was no linear sequence to his movement. I did not have to raise my head to keep him within my field of vision. I saw the line pulling him, then I felt his movement in my body, or with my body, and the next instant he was on the very top of the cliff, hundreds of feet up. After a few minutes he plummeted down. I felt his falling and groaned involuntarily. Don Gennaro repeated his feat 3 more times. Each time, my perception was tuned. During his last upward leap, I could actually distinguish a series of lines emanating from his midsection, and I knew when he was about to ascend or descend, judging by the way the lines of his body moved. When he was about to leap upward, the lines bent upward. The opposite happened when he was about to leap downward, the lines bent outward and down. After his 4th leap, Don Gennaro came to us and sat down behind Pablito and Nestor. Then Don Juan moved to the front and stood where Don Gennaro had been. He stood motionless for a while. Don Gennaro gave some brief instructions to Pablito and Nestor. I did not understand what he had said. I glanced at them and saw that he had made each one hold a rock and place it against the area of their navels. I was wondering whether I also had to do that when he told me that the precaution did not apply to me, but nonetheless I should have a rock within reach, just in case I got ill. Don Gennaro jutted his chin forward to indicate that I should gaze at Don Juan. Then he said something unintelligible. He repeated it, and although I did not understand his words, I knew that it was more or less the same formula that Don Juan had voiced. The words did not really matter, it was the rhythm, the dryness of tone, the cough-like quality. I had the certainty that whatever language Don Gennaro was using was more appropriate than Spanish for the staccato quality of the rhythm. Don Juan did exactly as Don Gennaro had initially done, but then instead of leaping upward, he twirled around like a gymnast. In a semi-aware way, I expected him to land on his feet again. He never did. His body kept on twirling a few feet above the ground. The circles were very rapid at first, then they slowed down. From where I was, I could see Don Juan's body hanging, like Don Gennaro's body had, from a thread-like light. He whirled slowly as if allowing us to fully view him. Then he began to ascend. He gained altitude until he reached the top of the cliff. Don Juan was actually floating as if he had no weight. His turns were slow and evoked the image of an astronaut in space whirling around in a state of weightlessness. I got dizzy as I watched him. My feeling of getting ill seemed to trigger him, and he began to whirl at a greater speed. He moved away from the cliff, and as he gained speed, I became utterly sick. I grabbed the rock and placed it on my stomach. I pressed it against my body as hard as I could. Its touch soothed me a bit. The act of reaching for the rock and holding it against me had allowed me a moment's break. Although I had not taken my eyes away from Don Juan, I had nevertheless broken my concentration. Before I reached for the rock, I felt that the speed which his floating body had gained was blurring his shape. He looked like a rotating disc, and then a light that was spinning. After I had placed the rock against my body, his speed diminished. He looked like a hat floating in the air, a kite that bobbed back and forth. The movement of the kite was even more unsettling. I became uncontrollably ill. I heard the flapping of bird wings, and after a moment of uncertainty, I knew that the event had ended. I felt so ill and exhausted that I lay down to sleep. I must have dozed off for a while. I opened my eyes when someone shook my arm. It was Pablito. He spoke to me in a frantic tone and said that I could not fall asleep, because if I did, all of us would die. He insisted that we had to leave right away, even if we had to drag ourselves on all fours. He also seemed to be physically exhausted. In fact, I had the idea that we should spend the night there. The prospect of walking to my car in the dark seemed most dreadful to me. I tried to convince Pablito, who was getting more frantic. Nestor was so ill that he was indifferent. Pablito sat down in a state of total despair. I made an effort to organize my thoughts. It was quite dark by then, although there was still enough light to distinguish the rocks around us. The quietness was exquisite and soothing. I enjoyed the moment fully, but suddenly my body jumped. I heard the distant sound of a branch being cracked. I automatically turned to Pablito. He seemed to know what had happened to me. We grabbed Nestor by the armpits and practically lifted him up. We dragged him and ran. He apparently was the only one who knew the way. He gave us short commands from time to time. I was not concerned with what we did. My attention was focused on my left ear, which seemed to be a unit independent from the rest of me. Some feeling in me forced me to stop every so often and scan the surroundings with my ear. I knew something was following us. It was something massive. It crushed small rocks as it advanced. Nestor regained a degree of composure and walked by himself, holding on to Pablito's arm occasionally. We arrived at a group of trees. By then it was completely dark. I heard a sudden and extremely loud cracking sound. It was like the cracking of a monstrous whip that lashed the tops of the trees. I could feel a wave of some sort rippling overhead. Pablito and Nestor screamed and scrambled out of there at full speed. I wanted them to stop. I was not sure I could run in the dark. But at that instant I heard and felt a series of heavy exhalations right behind me. My fright was indescribable. The three of us ran together until we reached the car. Nestor led us in some unknown way. I thought that I should leave them at their houses and then go to a hotel in town. I would not have gone to Don Gennaro's place for anything in the world, but Nestor did not want to leave the car, neither did Pablito, and neither did I. We ended up at Pablito's house. He sent Nestor to buy some beer and cola, while his mother and sisters prepared food for us. Nestor made a joke and asked if he could be escorted by the oldest sister, in case he was attacked by dogs or drunkards. Pablito laughed and told me that he had been entrusted with Nestor. "Who has entrusted you with him?" I asked. "Power, of course," he replied. "At one time Nestor was older than me, but Gennaro did something to him, and now he's much younger. You saw that, didn't you?" "What did Don Gennaro do?" I asked. "You know, he made him a child again. He was too important and heavy. He would have died if he was not turned younger." There was something truly candid and endearing about Pablito. The simplicity of his explanation was overwhelming to me. Nestor was indeed younger. Not only did he look younger, but he acted like an innocent child. I knew without any doubt that he genuinely felt like one. "I take care of him," Pablito continued. "Gennaro says that it's an honor to look after a warrior. Nestor is a fine warrior." His eyes shone, like Don Gennaro's. He patted me vigorously on the back and laughed. "Wish him well, Carlitos," he said. "Wish him well." I was very tired. I had a strange surge of happy sadness. I told him that I came from a place where people rarely if ever wish one another well. "I know," he said. "The same thing happened to me. But I'm a warrior now and I can afford to wish him well." The bubble of perception. I spent the day by myself at Don Gennaro's house. I slept most of the time. Don Juan came back in the late afternoon, and we hiked, in complete silence, to a nearby range of mountains. We stopped at dusk and sat on the edge of a deep gorge until it was almost dark. Then Don Juan led me to another place close by, a monumental cliff with a sheer vertical rock wall. The cliff was unnoticeable from the trail that led to it. Don Juan, however, had shown it to me several times before. He had made me look over the edge and had told me that the whole cliff was a place of power, especially the base of it, which was a canyon several hundred feet down. Every time I had looked into it, I had had a discomforting chill. The canyon was always dark and menacing. Before we reached the place, Don Juan said that I had to go on by myself and meet Pablito on the edge of the cliff. He recommended that I should relax and perform the gate of power in order to wash away my nervous tiredness. Don Juan stepped aside, to the left of the trail, and the darkness simply swallowed him. I wanted to stop and examine where he had gone, but my body did not obey. I began to jog, although I was so tired that I could hardly keep on my feet. When I reached the cliff, I could not see anyone there, and I went on jogging in place, breathing deeply. After a while I relaxed a bit. I stood motionless with my back against a rock, and I noticed then the shape of a man a few feet away from me. He was sitting, hiding his head in his arms. I had a moment of intense fright and recoiled, but then I explained to myself that the man must be Pablito, and without any hesitation I advanced towards him. I called Pablito's name out loud. I figured that he must have been uncertain of who I was and had become so scared that he had covered his head not to look. But before I reached him, some inexplicable fear took possession of me. My body froze on the spot with my right arm already extended to touch him. The man lifted his head up. It was not Pablito. His eyes were two enormous mirrors, like a tiger's eyes. My body jumped backwards, my muscles tensed and then released the tension without the slightest influence of my volition, and I performed a backward leap, so fast and so far that under normal conditions, I would have plunged into a grandiose speculation about it. As it was, however, my fright was so out of proportion that I had no inclination for pondering, and I would have run out of there had it not been that someone held my arm forcibly. The feeling that someone was holding me by the arm threw me into total panic. I screamed. My outburst, instead of being the shriek I thought it should have been, was a long chilling yell. I turned to face my assailant. It was Pablito, who was shaking even more than me. My nervousness was at its peak. I could not talk, my teeth chattered, and ripples went through my back, making me jerk involuntarily. I had to breathe through my mouth. Pablito said, between chatters, that the Nagual had been waiting for him, that he had barely gotten out of its clutches when he bumped into me, and that I had nearly killed him with my yell. I wanted to laugh and made the most weird sounds imaginable. When I regained my calmness, I told Pablito that apparently the same thing had happened to me. The end result in my case had been that my fatigue had vanished. I felt instead an uncontainable surge of strength and well-being. Pablito seemed to be experiencing the same sensations. We began to giggle in a nervous, silly way. I heard the sound of soft and careful steps in the distance. I detected the sound before Pablito. He appeared to react to my stiffening. I had the certainty that someone was approaching the place where we were. We turned in the direction of the sound. A moment later, the silhouettes of Don Juan and Don Genaro became visible. They were walking calmly and stopped 4 or 5 feet away from us. Don Juan was facing me, and Don Gennaro faced Pablito. I wanted to tell Don Juan that something had scared me nearly out of my wits, but Pablito squeezed my arm. I knew what he meant. There was something strange about Don Juan and Don Gennaro. As I looked at them, my eyes began to get out of focus. Don Gennaro gave a sharp command. I did not understand what he had said, but I knew he had meant that we should not cross our eyes. The darkness has settled on the world, Don Juan said, looking at the sky. Don Gennaro drew a half-moon on the hard ground. For a moment it seemed to me that he had used some iridescent chalk, but then I realized that he was not holding anything in his hands. I was perceiving the imaginary half-moon that he had drawn with his finger. He made Pablito and me sit on the inner curve of the convex edge, while he and Don Juan sat cross-legged on the extreme ends of the half-moon, 6 or 7 feet away from us. Don Juan spoke first. He said that they were going to show us their allies. He told us that if we would gaze at their left sides, between their hips and their rib bones, we would see something like a rag or a handkerchief hanging from their belts. Don Gennaro added that next to the rags on their belts, there were 2 round button-like things, and that we should gaze at their belts until we saw the rags and the buttons. Before Don Gennaro had spoken, I had already noticed some flat item, like a piece of cloth, and 1 round pebble that hung from their belts. Don Juan's allies were darker and more menacing than Don Gennaro's. My reaction was a mixture of curiosity and fear. My reactions were experienced in my stomach, and I was not judging anything in a rational manner. Don Juan and Don Gennaro reached for their belts and seemed to unhook the dark pieces of cloth. They took them with their left hands. Don Juan flung his in the air above his head, but Don Gennaro let his drop to the ground gently. The pieces of cloth stretched as if the hurling and the dropping had made them spread like perfectly smooth handkerchiefs. They descended slowly, bobbing like kites. The movement of Don Juan's ally was the exact replica of what I had perceived him doing when he had whirled around days before. As the pieces of cloth got closer to the ground, they became solid, round and massive. They first curled as though they had fallen over a doorknob, then they expanded. Don Juan's grew into a voluminous shadow. It took the lead and moved towards us, crushing small rocks and hard lumps of dirt. It came within 4 or 5 feet of us to the very dip of the half-moon, between Don Juan and Don Gennaro. At one moment I thought it was going to roll over us and pulverize us. My terror at that instant was like a burning fire. The shadow in front of me was gigantic, perhaps 14 feet high and 6 feet across. It moved as if it were feeling its way around with no eyes. It jerked and wobbled. I knew that it was looking for me. Pablito at that moment hit his head against my chest. The sensation that his movement produced in me dispelled some of the awesome attention that I had focused on the shadow. The shadow seemed to become disassociated, judging by its erratic jerks, and then it moved out of sight, merging with the darkness around. I shook Pablito. He lifted his head and let out a muffled scream. I looked up. A strange man was staring at me. He seemed to have been right behind the shadow, perhaps hiding behind it. He was rather tall and lanky. He had a long face, no hair, and the left side of his head was covered by a rash or an eczema of some sort. His eyes were wild and shiny. His mouth was half open. He wore some strange pajama-like clothing. His pants were too short for him. I could not distinguish whether or not he had shoes on. He stood looking at us for what seemed to be a long time, as if waiting for an opening in order to lurch at us and tear us apart. There was so much intensity in his eyes. It was not hatred or violence, but some sort of animal feeling of distrust. I could not stand the tension any longer. I wanted to adapt a fighting position that Don Juan had taught me years before, and I would have done so had it not been for Pablito, who whispered that the ally could not go over the line that Don Genero had drawn on the ground. I realized then that there was indeed a bright line that seemed to detain whatever was in front of us. After a moment the man moved away to the left, just like the shadow before. I had the sensation that Don Juan and Don Genero had called them both back. There was a short quiet pause. I could not see Don Juan or Don Genero anymore. They were no longer sitting on the points of the half moon. Suddenly I heard the sound of two small pebbles hitting the solid rock floor where we were sitting, and in a flash the area in front of us lit up, as if a mellow yellowish light had been turned on. In front of us there was a ravenous beast, a giant nauseating-looking coyote or wolf. Its whole body was covered with a white secretion like perspiration or saliva. Its hair was raggedy and wet. Its eyes were wild. It growled with a blind fury that sent chills through me. Its jaws shivered and globs of saliva flew all over the place. It pawed the ground like a mad dog trying to get loose from a chain. Then it stood on its hind legs and moved its front paws and its jaws rapidly. All its fury seemed to be concentrated on breaking some barrier in front of us. I became aware that my fear of that crazed animal was of a different sort than the fear of the two apparitions I had witnessed before. My dread of that beast was a physical revulsion and horror. I looked on in utter impotence at its rage. Suddenly it seemed to lose its wildness and trotted out of sight. I heard then something else coming towards us, or perhaps I sensed it. All of a sudden the shape of a colossal feline loomed in front of us. I first saw its eyes in the darkness. They were huge and fixed like two pools of water reflecting light. It snorted and growled softly. It exhaled air and moved back and forth in front of us without taking its eyes away from us. It did not have the electric glow that the coyote had. I could not distinguish its features clearly, and yet its presence was infinitely more ominous than the other beasts. It seemed to be gathering strength. I felt that it was so daring that it would go beyond its limits. Pablito must have had a similar feeling, for he whispered that I should duck my head and lie almost flat against the ground. A second later the feline charged. It ran towards us, and then it leaped with its paws extended forward. I closed my eyes and hid my head in my arms against the ground. I felt that the beast had ripped the protective line that Don Genero had drawn around us and was actually on top of us. I felt its weight pinning me down. The fur on its belly rubbed against my neck. It seemed that its forelegs were caught in something. It wriggled to set itself free. I felt its jerking and prodding and heard its diabolic puffing and hissing. I knew then that I was lost. I had a vague sense of irrational choice, and I wanted to resign myself calmly to my fate of dying there, but I was afraid of the physical pain of dying under such awful circumstances. Then some strange force surged from my body. It was as if my body refused to die and pooled all its strength in one single point, my left arm and hand. I felt an indomitable surge coming through it. Something uncontrollable was taking possession of my body. something that forced me to push the massive malignant weight of that beast off of us. Pablito seemed to have reacted in the same fashion, and we both stood up at once. There was so much energy created by both of us that the beast was flung like a rag doll. The exertion had been supreme. I collapsed on the ground, panting for air. The muscles of my stomach were so tense that I could not breathe. I did not pay any attention to what Pablito was doing. I finally noticed that Don Juan and Don Genaro were helping me to sit up. I saw Pablito spread on the ground face down with his arms outstretched. He seemed to have fainted. After they had made me sit up, Don Juan and Don Genaro helped Pablito. Both of them rubbed his stomach and back. They made him stand up, and after a while he could sit up by himself again. Don Juan and Don Genaro sat on the ends of the half moon, and then they began to move in front of us, as if a rail existed between the 2 points, a rail that they were using to shift their positions back and forth from one side to the other. Their movements made me dizzy. They finally stopped next to Pablito and began to whisper in his ear. After a moment they stood up, all 3 of them at once, and walked to the edge of the cliff. Don Genaro lifted Pablito as if he were a child. Pablito's body was stiff like a board. Don Juan held Pablito by the ankles. He whirled him around, seemingly to gain momentum and force, and finally he let go of his legs and hurled his body out over the abyss away from the edge of the cliff. I saw Pablito's body against a dark western sky. It described circles, just like Don Juan's body had done days before. The circles were slow. Pablito seemed to be gaining altitude instead of falling down. Then the circling became accelerated. Pablito's body twirled like a disc for a moment, and then it disintegrated. I perceived that it had vanished in thin air. Don Juan and Don Genaro came to my side, squatted by me, and proceeded to whisper in my ears. Each said something different, yet I had no trouble in following their commands. It was as if I became split the instant they uttered their first words. I felt that they were doing with me what they had done with Pablito. Don Genaro made me whirl, and then I had the thoroughly conscious sensation of spinning or floating for a moment. Next I was rushing through the air, plummeting down to the ground at a tremendous speed. I felt, as I was falling, that my clothes were ripping off, then my flesh fell off, and finally only my head remained. I had the very clear sensation that as my body became dismembered, I lost my superfluous weight, and thus my falling lost its momentum, and my speed decreased. My descent was no longer a vertigo. I began to move back and forth like a leaf. Then my head was stripped of its weight, and all that was left of me was a square centimeter, a nugget, a tiny pebble like residue. All my feeling was concentrated there. Then the nugget seemed to burst and I was 1,000 pieces. I knew, or something somewhere knew, that I was aware of the 1,000 pieces at once. I was the awareness itself. Then some part of that awareness began to be stirred. It rose, grew. It became localized, and little by little I regained the sense of boundaries, consciousness or whatever. And suddenly the me I knew and was familiar with erupted into the most spectacular view of all the imaginable combinations of beautiful scenes. It was as if I were looking at thousands of pictures of the world, of people, of things. The scenes then became blurry. I had the sensation that they were being passed in front of my eyes at a greater speed, until I could not single out any of them for examination. Finally, it was as if I were witnessing the organization of the world rolling past my eyes in an unbroken, endless chain. I suddenly found myself standing on the cliff with Don Juan and Don Gennaro. They whispered that they had pulled me back, and that I had witnessed the unknown that no one can talk about. They said that they were going to hurl me into it once more, and that I should let the wings of my perception unfold and touch the tonal and the nagual at once, without being aware of going back and forth from one to the other. I again had the sensations of being tossed, spinning, and falling down at a tremendous speed. Then I exploded. I disintegrated. Something in me gave out. It released something I had kept locked up all my life. I was thoroughly aware then that my secret reservoir had been tapped, and that it poured out unrestrainedly. There was no longer the sweet unity I call me. There was nothing, and yet that nothing was filled. It was not light or darkness, hot or cold, pleasant or unpleasant. It was not that I moved or floated or was stationary. Neither was I a single unit, a self, as I am accustomed to being. I was a myriad of selves which were all me, a colony of separate units that had a special allegiance to one another, and would join unavoidably to form one single awareness, my human awareness. It was not that I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt, because there was nothing I could have known with, but all my single awarenesses knew that the me, of my familiar world was a colony, a conglomerate of separate and independent feelings that had an unbending solidarity to one another. The unbending solidarity of my countless awarenesses, the allegiance that those parts had for one another was my life force. A way of describing that unified sensation would be to say that those nuggets of awareness were scattered, each of them was aware of itself, and none was more predominant than the other. Then something would stir them, and they would join and emerge onto an area where all of them had to be pooled in one clump, the me I know. As me myself, then I would witness a coherent scene of worldly activity, or a scene that pertained to other worlds, and which I thought must have been pure imagination, or a scene that pertained to pure thinking, that is, I had views of intellectual systems, or of ideas strung together as verbalizations. In some scenes I talked to myself to my heart's content. After every one of those coherent views the me would disintegrate and be nothing once more. During one of those excursions into a coherent view I found myself on the cliff with Don Juan. I instantly realized that I was then the total me I am familiar with. I felt my physicality as real. I was in the world rather than merely viewing it. Don Juan hugged me like a child. He looked at me. His face was very close. I could see his eyes in the darkness. They were kind. They seemed to hold a question. I knew what it was. The unspeakable was truly unspeakable. "Well?" he asked softly, as if he would need my reaffirmation. I was speechless. The words numb, bewildered, confused, and so on were not in any way appropriate descriptions of my feelings at that moment. I was not solid. I knew that Don Juan had to grab me and keep me forcibly on the ground, otherwise I would have floated in the air and disappeared. I was not afraid of vanishing. I longed for the unknown where my awareness was not unified. Don Juan walked me slowly, pushing down on both of my shoulders, to an area around Don Gennaro's house. He made me lie down, and then covered me with soft dirt from a pile that he seemed to have prepared beforehand. He covered me up to my neck. With leaves he made a sort of pillow for my head to rest on, and told me not to move or fall asleep at all. He said that he was going to sit and keep me company until the earth had again consolidated my form. I felt very comfortable and had a nearly invincible desire to fall asleep, but Don Juan would not let me. He demanded that I should talk about anything under the sun, except what I had just experienced. I did not know what to talk about at first, then I asked about Don Genaro. Don Juan said that Don Genaro had taken Pablito and had buried him somewhere around there and was doing with him what he himself was doing with me. I had the desire to sustain the conversation, but something in me was incomplete. I had an unusual indifference, a tiredness that was more like boredom. Don Juan seemed to know how I felt. He began to talk about Pablito and how our fates were interlocked. He said that he became Pablito's benefactor at the same time that Don Genaro became his teacher, and that power had paired Pablito and me step by step. He made the emphatic remark that the only difference between Pablito and me was that while Pablito's world as a warrior was governed by coercion and fear, mine was governed by affection and freedom. Don Juan explained that such a difference was due to the intrinsically different personalities of the benefactors. Don Genaro was sweet and affectionate and funny, while he himself was dry, authoritarian and direct. He said that my personality demanded a strong teacher but a tender benefactor, and that Pablito was the opposite. He needed a kind teacher and a stern benefactor. We talked for a while longer and then it was morning. When the sun appeared over the mountains on the eastern horizon, he helped me to get up from under the dirt. After I woke up in the early afternoon, Don Juan and I sat by the door of Don Genaro's house. Don Juan said that Don Genaro was still with Pablito, preparing him for the last encounter. "Tomorrow you and Pablito will go into the unknown," he said. "I must prepare you for it now. You will go into it by yourselves. Last night you two were like yo-yos being pulled back and forth. Tomorrow you will be on your own." I had then a rush of curiosity, and questions about my experiences of the night before just poured out of me. He was unruffled by my barrage. "Today I have to accomplish a most crucial maneuver," he said. "I have to trick you for the last time. And you must fall for my tricking." He laughed and slapped his thighs. "What Genaro wanted to show you with the first exercise the other night was how sorcerers use the Nagual," he went on. "There's no way to get to the sorcerer's explanation unless one has willingly used the Nagual, or rather, unless one has willingly used the tonal to make sense out of one's actions in the Nagual. Another way of making all this clear is to say that the view of the tonal must prevail if one is going to use the Nagual the way sorcerers do." I told him that I had found a blatant incongruity in what he had just said. On the one hand, he had given me, 2 days before, an incredible recapitulation of his studied acts over a period of years, acts designed to affect my view of the world, and on the other hand, he wanted that same view to prevail. "One thing has nothing to do with the other," he said. "Order in our perception is the exclusive realm of the tonal, only there can our actions have a sequence, only there are they like stairways where one can count the steps. There is nothing of that sort in the Nagual. Therefore, the view of the tonal is a tool, and as such it is not only the best tool, but the only one we've got. Last night your bubble of perception opened and its wings unfolded. There is nothing else to say about it. It is impossible to explain what happened to you, so I'm not going to attempt to, and you shouldn't try to either. It should be enough to say that the wings of your perception were made to touch your totality. Last night you went back and forth from the Nagual to the tonal time and time again. You were hurled in twice so as to leave no possibility for mistakes. The second time you experienced a full impact of the journey into the unknown. And your perception unfolded its wings when something in you realized your true nature. You are a cluster. This is the sorcerer's explanation. The Nagual is the unspeakable. All the possible feelings and beings and selves float in it like barges, peaceful, unaltered, forever. Then the glue of life binds some of them together. You yourself found that out last night, and so did Pablito, and so did Genero the time he journeyed into the unknown, and so did I. When the glue of life binds those feelings together, a being is created, a being that loses the sense of its true nature and becomes blinded by the glare and clamor of the area where beings hover, the tonal. The tonal is where all the unified organization exists. A being pops into the tonal once the force of life has bound all the needed feelings together. I said to you once that the tonal begins at birth and ends at death. I said that because I know that as soon as the force of life leaves the body, all those single awarenesses disintegrate and go back again to where they came from, the Nagual. What a warrior does in journeying into the unknown is very much like dying, except that his cluster of single feelings do not disintegrate, but expand a bit without losing their togetherness. At death, however, they sink deeply and move independently as if they had never been a unit. I wanted to tell him how completely homogeneous were his statements with my experience. But he did not let me talk. There is no way to refer to the unknown, he said. One can only witness it. The sorcerer's explanation says that each of us has a center from which the Nagual can be witnessed, the will. Thus, a warrior can venture into the Nagual and let his cluster arrange and rearrange itself in any way possible. I've said to you that the expression of the Nagual is a personal matter. I meant that it is up to the individual warrior himself to direct the arrangement and rearrangements of that cluster. The human form or human feeling is the original one. Perhaps it is the sweetest form of them all to us. There are, however, an endless number of alternative forms which the cluster may adopt. I've said to you that a sorcerer can adopt any form he wants. That is true. A sorcerer who is in possession of the totality of himself can direct the parts of his cluster to join in any conceivable way. The force of life is what makes all that shuffling possible. Once the force of life is exhausted, there is no way to reassemble that cluster. I have called that cluster the bubble of perception. I have also said that it is sealed, closed tightly, and that it never opens until the moment of our death. Yet it could be made to open. Sorcerers have obviously learned that secret, and although not all of them arrive at the totality of themselves, they know about the possibility of it. They know that the bubble opens only when one plunges into the Nagual. Yesterday I gave you a recapitulation of all the steps that you have followed to arrive at that point. He scrutinized me as if he were waiting for a comment or a question. What he had said was beyond comment. I understood then that it would have been of no consequence if he had told me everything 14 years before, or if he would have told it to me at any point during my apprenticeship. What was important was the fact that I had experienced with or in my body the premises of his explanation. I'm waiting for your usual question, he said, voicing his words slowly. What question? I asked. The one your reason is itching to voice. Today I relinquish all questions. I really don't have any, Don Juan. That's not fair, he said, laughing. There is one particular question that I need you to ask. He said that if I would shut off my internal dialogue for just an instant, I could discern what the question was. I had a sudden thought, a momentary insight, and I knew what he wanted. Where was my body while all that was happening to me, Don Juan? I asked, and he broke into a belly laugh. This is the last of the sorcerer's tricks, he said. Let's say that what I'm going to reveal to you is the last bit of the sorcerer's explanation. Up to this point, your reason has haphazardly followed my doings. Your reason is willing to admit that the world is not as the description portrays it, that there is much more to it than what meets the eye. Your reason is almost willing and ready to admit that your perception went up and down that cliff, or that something in you, or even all of you, leaped to the bottom of the gorge and examined with the eyes of the tonal what was there, as if you had descended bodily with a rope and ladder. That act of examining the bottom of the gorge was the crown of all these years of training. You did it well. Gennaro saw the cubic centimeter of chance when he threw a rock at the you that was at the bottom of the ravine. You saw everything, Gennaro, and I knew then without a doubt that you were ready to be hurled into the unknown. At that instant you not only saw, but you knew all about the double, the other. I interrupted and told him that he was giving me undeserving credit for something that was beyond my understanding. His reply was that I needed time to let all those impressions settle down, and that once I had done that, answers would just pour out of me in the same manner that questions had poured out of me in the past. The secret of the double is in the bubble of perception, which in your case that night was at the top of the cliff and at the bottom of the gorge at the same time, he said. The cluster of feelings can be made to assemble instantly anywhere. In other words, one can perceive the here and the there at once. He urged me to think and remember a sequence of actions which he said were so ordinary that I had almost forgotten them. I did not know what he was talking about. He coaxed me to try harder. Think about your hat, he said. And think what Gennaro did with it. I had a shocking moment of realization. I had forgotten that Don Gennaro had actually wanted me to take off my hat because it kept on falling off, blown by the wind. But I did not want to let go of it. I had felt stupid being naked. Wearing a hat, which I ordinarily never do, gave me a sense of strangeness. I was not really myself, in which case being without clothes was not so embarrassing. Don Gennaro had then attempted to change hats with me, but his was too small for my head. He made jokes about the size of my head and the proportions of my body, and finally he took my hat off and wrapped my head with an old poncho, like a turban. I told Don Juan that I had forgotten about that sequence, which I was sure had happened in between my so-called leaps. And yet the memory of those leaps stood as a unit which was uninterrupted. They certainly were an uninterrupted unit, and so was Gennaro's cavorting with your hat, he said. Those two memories cannot be made to go one after the other because they happened at the same time. He made the fingers of his left hand move as if they could not fit into the spaces between the fingers of his right hand. Those leaps were only the beginning, he went on. Then came your true excursion into the unknown. Last night you experienced the unspeakable, the Nagual. Your reason cannot fight the physical knowledge that you are a nameless cluster of feelings. Your reason at this point might even admit that there is another center of assemblage, the will, through which it is possible to judge or assess and use the extraordinary effects of the Nagual. It has finally dawned on your reason that one can reflect the Nagual through the will, although one can never explain it. But then comes your question, where was I when all that was taking place? Where was my body? The conviction that there is a real you is a result of the fact that you have rallied everything you've got around your reason. At this point your reason admits that the Nagual is the indescribable, not because the evidence has convinced it, but because it is safe to admit that. Your reason is on safe ground, all the elements of the tonal are on its side. Don Juan paused and examined me. His smile was kind. "Let's go to Genero's place of predilection," he said abruptly. He stood up and we walked to the rock where we had talked 2 days before. We sat comfortably on the same spots with our backs against the rock. To make reason feel safe is always the task of the teacher, he said. I've tricked your reason into believing that the tonal was accountable and predictable. Genero and I have labored to give you the impression that only the Nagual was beyond the scope of explanation. The proof that the tricking was successful is that at this moment, it seems to you that in spite of everything you have gone through, there is still a core that you can claim as your own, your reason. That's a mirage. Your precious reason is only a center of assemblage, a mirror that reflects something which is outside of it. Last night you witnessed not only the indescribable Nagual, but also the indescribable tonal. The last piece of the sorcerer's explanation says that reason is merely reflecting an outside order, and that reason knows nothing about that order. It cannot explain it, in the same way it cannot explain the Nagual. Reason can only witness the effects of the tonal, but never ever could it understand it, or unravel it. The very fact that we are thinking and talking points out an order that we follow without ever knowing how we do that, or what the order is. I brought up then the idea of Western man's research into the workings of the brain, as a possibility of explaining what that order was. He pointed out that all that research did was to attest that something was happening. Sorcerers do the same thing with their will, he said. They say that through the will they can witness the effects of the Nagual. I can add now that through reason, no matter what we do with it, or how we do it, we are merely witnessing the effects of the tonal. In both cases there is no hope, ever, to understand or to explain what it is that we are witnessing. Last night was the first time that you flew on the wings of your perception. You were still very timid. You ventured only on the band of human perception. A sorcerer can use those wings to touch other sensibilities, a crow's for instance, a coyote's, a cricket's, or the order of other worlds in that infinite space. Do you mean other planets, Don Juan? Certainly. The wings of perception can take us to the most recondite confines of the Nagual, or to inconceivable worlds of the tonal. Can a sorcerer go to the moon, for instance? Of course he can, he replied. But he wouldn't be able to bring back a bag of rocks, though. We laughed and joked about it, but his statement had been made in ultimate seriousness. We have arrived at the last part of the sorcerer's explanation, he said. Last night Genero and I showed you the last 2 points that make the totality of man, the Nagual and the tonal. I once told you that those 2 points were outside of oneself, and yet they were not. That is the paradox of the luminous beings. The tonal of every one of us is but a reflection of that indescribable unknown filled with order. The Nagual of every one of us is but a reflection of that indescribable void that contains everything. Now you should sit on Gennaro's place of predilection until twilight. By then you should have pounded the sorcerer's explanation into place. As you sit here now, you have nothing except the force of your life that binds that cluster of feelings." He stood up. "Tomorrow's task is to plunge into the unknown by yourself while Gennaro and I watch you without intervening," he said. "Sit here and turn off your internal dialogue. You may gather the power needed to unfold the wings of your perception and flight it at infinitude." The predecessor of two warriors. Don Juan woke me up at the crack of dawn. He handed me a carrying gourd filled with water and a bag of dry meat. We walked in silence for a couple of miles to the place where I had left my car 2 days before. "This journey is our last journey together," he said in a quiet voice when we arrived at my car. I felt a strong jolt in my stomach. I knew what he meant. He leaned against a back fender as I opened the passenger door, and he looked at me with a feeling that had never been there before. We got in the car, but before I started the motor he made some obscure remarks that I also understood to perfection. He said that we had a few minutes to sit in the car and touch again upon some feelings very personal and poignant. I sat quietly, but my spirit was restless. I wanted to say something to him, something that would have essentially soothed me. I searched in vain for the appropriate words, the formula that would have expressed the thing I knew without being told. Don Juan talked about a little boy that I once knew, and about how my feelings for him would not change with the years or the distance. Don Juan said that he was certain that every time I thought of that little boy my spirit jumped joyfully, and without a trace of selfishness or pettiness, wished him the best. He reminded me of a story that I had once told him about the little boy, a story which he had liked and had found to have a profound meaning. During one of our hikes in the mountains around Los Angeles, the little boy had gotten tired of walking, so I had let him ride on my shoulders. A wave of intense happiness engulfed us then, and the little boy shouted his thanks to the sun and to the mountains. "That was his way of saying goodbye to you," Don Juan said. I felt the sting of anguish in my throat. "There are many ways of saying farewell," he said. "The best way is perhaps by holding a particular memory of joyfulness. For instance, if you live like a warrior, the warmth you felt when the little boy rode on your shoulders will be fresh and cutting for as long as you live. That is a warrior's way of saying farewell." I hurriedly turned on the motor and drove faster than usual on the hard-packed rocky ground until we got onto the unpaved road. We drove a short distance and then we walked the rest of the way. After about an hour we came to a grove of trees. Don Gennaro, Pablito, and Nestor were there waiting for us. I greeted them. All of them appeared to be so happy and vigorous. As I looked at them and at Don Juan, I was overcome by a feeling of profound empathy for all of them. Don Gennaro embraced me and patted me affectionately on the back. He told Nestor and Pablito that I had had a fine performance leaping into the bottom of a ravine. With his hand still on my shoulder, he addressed them in a loud voice. "Yes, sir," he said, looking at them. "I'm his benefactor and I know that that was quite an achievement. That was the crown of years of living like a warrior." He turned to me and placed his other hand on my shoulder. His eyes were shiny and peaceful. "There's nothing I can say to you, Carlitos," he said, voicing his words slowly, "except that you had an extraordinary amount of excrement in your bowels." With that he and Don Juan howled with laughter until they seemed about to pass out. Pablito and Nestor giggled nervously, not knowing exactly what to do. When Don Juan and Don Genaro had quieted down, Pablito said to me that he was unsure of his capability of going into the unknown by himself. "I really don't have the faintest idea of how to do it," he said. Genaro says that one needs nothing except impeccability. What do you think? I told him that I knew even less than he did. Nestor sighed and seemed truly concerned. He moved his hands and his mouth nervously, as if he were on the verge of saying something important and did not know how. "Genaro says that you two will make it," he finally said. Don Genaro signaled with his hand that we were leaving. He and Don Juan walked together, a few yards ahead of us. We followed the same mountain trail nearly all day. We walked in complete silence and never stopped. All of us had a provision of dry meat and a gourd of water, and it was understood that we would eat as we walked. At a certain point the trail definitely became a road. It curved around the side of a mountain, and suddenly the view of a valley opened up in front of us. It was a breathtaking sight, a long green valley glimmering in sunlight. There were two magnificent rainbows over it, and patches of rain all over the surrounding hills. Don Juan stopped walking and jutted his chin to point out something down in the valley to Don Genaro. Don Genaro shook his head. It was not an affirmative or negative gesture, it was more like a jerk of his head. They both stood motionless, peering into the valley for a long time. We left the road there and took what seemed to be a shortcut. We began to descend via a more narrow and hazardous path that led to the northern part of the valley. When we reached the flatland, it was mid-afternoon. The strong scent of river willows and moist dirt enveloped me. For a moment the rain was like a soft green rumble on the nearby trees to my left, then it was only a quivering in the reeds. I heard the rustling of a stream. I stopped for a moment to listen. I looked at the top of the trees. The high cirrus clouds on the western horizon looked like puffs of cotton scattered in the sky. I stood there watching the clouds long enough for everyone else to get quite a bit ahead of me. I ran after them. Don Juan and Don Genaro stopped and turned around in unison. Their eyes moved and focused on me with such uniformity and precision that they seemed to be one single person. It was a brief, stupendous glance that sent chills through my back. Then Don Genaro laughed and said that I ran thumping, like a 300-pound flat-footed Mexican. "Why a Mexican?" Don Juan asked. "A flat-footed 300-pound Indian doesn't run," Don Genaro said in an explanatory tone. "Oh," Don Juan said, as if Don Genaro had really explained something. We crossed the narrow, lush green valley and climbed into the mountains to the east. By late afternoon we finally came to a halt on top of a flat, barren mesa that overlooked a high valley towards the south. The vegetation had changed drastically. There were round, eroded mountains all around. The land in the valley and on the sides of the hills was parceled and cultivated, and yet the entire scene gave me the feeling of barrenness. The sun was already low on the southwest horizon. Don Juan and Don Genaro called us to the northern edge of the mesa. From that point the view was sublime. There were endless valleys and mountains towards the north, and a range of high sierras towards the west. The sunlight reflecting on the distant northern mountains made them look orange, like the color of the banks of clouds over the west. The scenery, in spite of its beauty, was sad and lonely. Don Juan handed me my writing pad, but I did not feel like taking notes. We sat in a half circle with Don Juan and Don Genero at the ends. You started on the path of knowledge writing, and you will finish the same way, Don Juan said. All of them urged me to write, as if my writing were essential. You're at the very edge, Carlitos, Don Genero said suddenly. You and Pablito both. His voice was soft. Without his joking tone, he sounded kind and worried. Other warriors journeying into the unknown have stood on this very spot, he went on. They all wish you two very well. I felt a ripple around me as if the air had been half solid, and something had created a wave that rippled through it. All of us here wish you two well, he said. Nestor embraced Pablito and me, and then he sat apart from us. We still have some time, Don Genero said, looking at the sky. And then turning to Nestor, he asked, what should we do in the meantime? We should laugh and enjoy ourselves, Nestor answered briskly. I told Don Juan that I was afraid of what was waiting for me, and that I had most certainly been tricked into all that. I who had not even imagined that situations like the one Pablito and I were living existed. I said that something truly awesome had taken possession of me and little by little had pushed me until I was facing something perhaps worse than death. You're complaining, Don Juan said dryly. You're feeling sorry for yourself to the last minute. They all laughed. He was right. What an invincible urge. And I thought I had vanquished it from my life. I begged all of them to forgive my idiocy. Don't apologize, Don Juan said to me. Apologies are nonsense. What really matters is being an impeccable warrior in this unique place of power. This place has harbored the finest warriors. Be as fine as they were. Then he addressed both Pablito and me. You already know that this is the last task in which we will be together, he said. You will enter into the Nagual and the Tonal by the force of your personal power alone. Genero and I are here only to bid you farewell. Power has determined that Nestor should be a witness. So be it. This will also be the last crossroad of yours which Genero and I will attend. Once you have entered the unknown by yourself, you cannot depend on us to bring you back, so a decision is mandatory. You must decide whether or not to return. We are confident that you too have the strength to return if you choose to do so. The other night you were perfectly capable, in unison or separately, to throw off the ally that otherwise would have crushed you to death. That was a test of your strength. I must also add that few warriors survive the encounter with the unknown that you are about to have, not so much because it is hard, but because the Nagual is enticing beyond any statement, and warriors who are journeying into it find that to return to the Tonal, or to the world of order and noise and pain, is a most unappealing affair. The decision to stay or to return is done by something in us, which is neither our reason nor our desire, but our will, so there is no way of knowing the outcome of it beforehand. If you choose not to return, you will disappear as if the earth had swallowed you. But if you choose to return to this earth, you must wait like true warriors until your particular tasks are finished. Once they are finished, either in success or defeat, you will have the command over the totality of yourselves. Don Juan paused for a moment. Don Genero looked at me and winked. Carlitos wants to know what it means to have command over the totality of oneself, he said, and everybody laughed. He was right. Under other circumstances I would have asked about it. The situation, however, was too solemn for questions. It means that the warrior has finally encountered power, Don Juan said. No one can tell what each warrior would do with it. Perhaps you too will roam peacefully and unnoticed on the face of the earth. Or perhaps you will turn out to be hateful men. Or perhaps notorious or kind. All that depends on the impeccability and the freedom of your spirit. The important thing, however, is your task. That is the bestowal made by a teacher and a benefactor to their apprentices. I pray that you too will succeed in bringing your tasks to a culmination. Waiting to fulfill that task is a very special waiting, Don Juan said all of a sudden. And I'm going to tell you the story of a band of warriors who lived in another time on the mountains, somewhere in that direction. He casually pointed to the east, but then, after a moment's hesitation, he seemed to change his mind and stood up and pointed to the distant northern mountains. No. They lived in that direction, he said, looking at me and smiling with an air of erudition. Exactly 135 kilometers from here. Don Juan was perhaps imitating me. His mouth and forehead were contracted, his hands were tightly clasped against his chest, holding some imaginary object that he may have intended to be a notebook. He maintained a most ridiculous posture. I had once met a German scholar, a sinologist, who looked exactly like that. The thought that all along I might have been unconsciously imitating the grimaces of a German sinologist was utterly funny to me. I laughed by myself. It seemed to be a joke just for me. Don Juan sat down again and proceeded with his story. Whenever a member of that band of warriors was thought to have committed an act which was against their rules, his fate was put to the decision of all of them. The culprit had to explain his reasons for having done what he did. His comrades had to listen to him, and then they either disbanded because they had found his reasons convincing, or they lined up with their weapons at the very edge of a flat mountain, very much like this mountain where we are sitting now, ready to carry out his death sentence, because they had found his reasons to be unacceptable. In that case, the condemned warrior had to say goodbye to his old comrades, and his execution began. Don Juan looked at me and Pablito as if waiting for a sign from us. Then he turned to Nestor. Perhaps the witness here could tell us what the story has to do with these two, he said to Nestor. Nestor smiled shyly and seemed to immerse himself deep in thought for a moment. The witness has no idea, he said and broke up into a nervous giggle. Don Juan asked everyone to stand up and go with him to look over the west edge of the mesa. There was a mild slope down to the bottom of the land formation. Then there was a narrow flat strip of land ending in a crevice that seemed to be a natural channel for the runoff of rainwater. Right where that ditch is, there was a row of trees on the mountain in the story, he said. Beyond that point there was a thick forest. After saying goodbye to his comrades, the condemned warrior was supposed to begin walking down the slope towards the trees. His comrades then cocked their weapons and aimed at him. If no one shot, or if the warrior survived his wounds and reached the edge of the trees, he was free. We went back to the place where we had been sitting. How about now, witness? He asked Nestor. Can you tell? Nestor was the epitome of nervousness. He took off his hat and scratched his head. He then hid his face in his hands. How can the poor witness know? He finally retorted in a challenging tone and laughed with everybody else. They say that there were men who pulled through unharmed, Don Juan continued. Let's say that their personal power affected their comrades. A wave went through them as they were aiming at him, and no one dared to use his weapon. Or perhaps they were in awe of his bravery and could not harm him. Don General looked at me and then at Pablito. There was a condition set up for that walk to the edge of the trees, he went on. The warrior had to walk calmly, unaffected. His steps had to be sure and firm, his eyes looking straight ahead, peacefully. He had to go down without stumbling, without turning to look back, and above all without running. Don General paused. Pablito assented to his words by nodding. If you two decide to return to this earth, he said, you will have to wait like true warriors until your tasks are fulfilled. That waiting is very much like the walk of the warrior in the story. You see, the warrior had run out of human time, and so have you. The only difference is in who is aiming at you. Those who were aiming at the warrior were his warrior comrades. But what's aiming at you too is the unknown. Your only chance is your impeccability. You must wait without looking back. You must wait without expecting rewards. And you must aim all of your personal power at fulfilling your tasks. If you don't act impeccably, if you begin to fret and get impatient and desperate, you'll be cut down mercilessly by the sharpshooters from the unknown. If, on the other hand, your impeccability and personal power are such that you are capable of fulfilling your tasks, you will then achieve the promise of power. And what's that promise? You may ask. It is a promise that power makes to men as luminous beings. Each warrior has a different fate, so there is no way of telling what that promise will be for either of you. The sun was about to set. The light orange color on the distant northern mountains had become darker. The scenery gave me the feeling of a windswept, lonely world. You have learned that the backbone of a warrior is to be humble and efficient, Don General said, and his voice made me jump. You have learned to act without expecting anything in return. Now I tell you that in order to withstand what lies ahead of you beyond this day, you'll need your ultimate forbearance. I experienced a shock in my stomach. Pablito began to shiver quietly. A warrior must be always ready, he said. The fate of all of us here has been to know that we are the prisoners of power. No one knows why us in particular, but what a great fortune. Don General stopped talking and lowered his head as if he were exhausted. That had been the first time that I had heard him speak in such terms. It is mandatory here that a warrior says goodbye to all those present and to all those he leaves behind, Don Juan said suddenly. He must do this in his own words and loudly, so his voice will remain here forever in this place of power. Don Juan's voice brought forth another dimension to my state of being at that moment. Our conversation in the car became all the more poignant. How right he was when he had said that the serenity of the scenery around us was only a mirage, and that the sorcerer's explanation delivered a blow that no one could parry. I had heard the sorcerer's explanation and I had experienced its premises, and there I was, more naked and more helpless than ever in my entire life. Nothing that I had ever done, nothing that I had ever imagined, could even compare to the anguish and the loneliness of that moment. The sorcerer's explanation had stripped me even of my reason. Don Juan was right again when he said that a warrior could not avoid pain and grief, but only the indulging in them. At that moment my sadness was uncontainable. I could not stand to say goodbye to those who had shared with me the turns of my fate. I told Don Juan and Don General that I had made a pact with someone to die together, and that my spirit could not bear to leave alone. We are all alone, Carlitos, Don General said softly. That's our condition. I felt in my throat the anguish of my passion for life and for those close to me. I refused to say goodbye to them. "We are alone," Don Juan said. "But to die alone is not to die in loneliness." His voice sounded muffled and dry, like coughing. Pablito wept quietly. Then he stood up and spoke. It was not a harangue or a testimonial. In a clear voice he thanked Don Genaro and Don Juan for their kindness. He turned to Nestor and thanked him for having given him the opportunity to take care of him. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. What a wonderful thing it was to be in this beautiful world. In this marvelous time. He exclaimed and sighed. His mood was overwhelming. "If I don't return, I beg you as an ultimate favor to help those who have shared my fate," he said to Don Genaro. He then turned towards the west in the direction of his home. His lean body convulsed with tears. He ran towards the edge of the mesa with outstretched arms, as if he were running to embrace someone. His lips moved. He seemed to be talking in a low voice. I turned my head away. I did not want to hear what Pablito was saying. He came back to where we were sitting, slumped down next to me, and lowered his head. I was incapable of saying a thing. But then an outside force seemed to take over and made me stand up, and I too spoke my thanks and my sadness. We were quiet again. A north wind hissed softly, blowing in my face. Don Juan looked at me. I had never seen so much kindness in his eyes. He said to me that a warrior said farewell by thanking all those who had had a gesture of kindness or concern for him, and that I had to voice my gratitude not only to them, but also to those who had taken care of me and had helped me on my way. I faced the northwest, towards Los Angeles, and all the sentimentality of my spirit poured out. What a purifying release it was to voice my thanks. I sat down again. No one looked at me. A warrior acknowledges his pain, but he doesn't indulge in it, Don Juan said. Thus the mood of a warrior who enters into the unknown is not one of sadness. On the contrary, he's joyful because he feels humbled by his great fortune, confident that his spirit is impeccable, and above all, fully aware of his efficiency. A warrior's joyfulness comes from having accepted his fate and from having truthfully assessed what lies ahead of him. There was a long pause. My sadness was paramount. I wanted to do something to get out of such oppressiveness. "Witness, please squeeze your spirit catcher," Don Genaro said to Nestor. I heard the loud, most ludicrous sound of Nestor's contraption. Pablito nearly got hysterical laughing, and so did Don Juan and Don Genaro. I noticed a peculiar smell and realized then that Nestor had farted. What was horrendously funny was the expression of ultimate seriousness on his face. He had farted not as a joke, but because he did not have his spirit catcher with him. He was being helpful in the best way he could. All of them laughed with abandon. What facility they had for shifting from sublime situations to utterly ludicrous ones. Pablito turned to me suddenly. He wanted to know if I was a poet, but before I could answer his question, Don Genaro made a rhyme. "Carlitos is really cool, he's got a bit of a poet, and nothing a fool," he said. They all had another outburst of laughter. "That's a better mood," Don Juan said. "And now, before Genaro and I say goodbye to you, you two may say anything you please. It might be the last time you utter a word, ever." Pablito shook his head negatively, but I had something to say. I wanted to express my admiration, my awe for the exquisite temper of Don Juan, and Don Genero's warrior spirit. But I became entangled in my words and ended up saying nothing, or even worse yet, I ended up sounding as if I were complaining again. Don Juan shook his head and smacked his lips in mock disapproval. I laughed involuntarily. It did not matter, however, that I had flubbed my chance to tell them of my admiration. A very intriguing sensation began to take possession of me. I had a sense of exhilaration and joy, an exquisite freedom that made me laugh. I told Don Juan and Don Genero that I did not give a fig about the outcome of my encounter with the unknown, that I was happy and complete, and that whether I lived or died was of no importance to me at that moment. Don Juan and Don Genero seemed to enjoy my assertions even more than I did. Don Juan slapped his thigh and laughed. Don Genero threw his hat on the floor and yelled as if he were riding a wild horse. We have enjoyed ourselves and laughed while waiting, just as the witness recommended, Don Genero said all of a sudden. But it is the natural condition of order that it should always come to an end. He looked at the sky. It's almost time for us to disband like the warriors in the story, he said. But before we go our separate ways, I must tell you one last thing. I am going to disclose to you a warrior's secret. Perhaps you can call it a warrior's predilection. He addressed me in particular and said that once I had told him that the life of a warrior was cold and lonely and devoid of feelings. He even added that at that precise moment I was convinced that it was so. The life of a warrior cannot possibly be cold and lonely and without feelings, he said, because it is based on his affection, his devotion, his dedication to his beloved. And who, you may ask, is his beloved? I will show you now. Don Genero stood up and walked slowly to a perfectly flat area right in front of us, 10 or 12 feet away. He made a strange gesture there. He moved his hands as if he were sweeping dust from his chest and his stomach. Then an odd thing happened. A flash of an almost imperceptible light went through him. It came from the ground and seemed to kindle his entire body. He did a sort of backward pirouette, a backward dive more properly speaking, and landed on his chest and arms. His movement had been executed with such precision and skill that he seemed to be a weightless being, a worm-like creature that had turned on itself. When he was on the ground, he performed a series of unearthly movements. He glided just a few inches above the ground, or rolled on it as if he were lying on ball bearings, or he swam on it describing circles and turning with the swiftness and agility of an eel swimming in the ocean. My eyes began to cross at one moment, and then without any transition, I was watching a ball of luminosity sliding back and forth on something that appeared to be the floor of an ice skating rink, with 1,000 lights shining on it. The sight was sublime. Then the ball of fire came to rest and stayed motionless. A voice shook me and dispelled my attention. It was Don Juan talking. I could not understand at first what he was saying. I looked again at the ball of fire. I could distinguish only Don Genero lying on the ground with his arms and legs spread out. Don Juan's voice was very clear. It seemed to trigger something in me and I began to write. Genero's love is the world, he said. He was just now embracing this enormous earth, but since he's so little, all he can do is swim in it. But the earth knows that Genero toves it, and it bestows on him its care. That's why Genero's life is filled to the brim, and his state, wherever he'll be, will be plentiful. Genero roams on the paths of his love, and, wherever he is complete. Don Juan squatted in front of us. He caressed the ground gently. "This is the predilection of two warriors," he said. "This earth, this world. For a warrior there can be no greater love." Don Genaro stood up and squatted next to Don Juan for a moment, while both of them peered fixedly at us. Then they sat in unison, cross-legged. "Only if one loves this earth with unbending passion can one release one's sadness," Don Juan said. "A warrior is always joyful because his love is unalterable and his beloved, the earth, embraces him and bestows upon him inconceivable gifts. The sadness belongs only to those who hate the very thing that gives shelter to their beings." Don Juan again caressed the ground with tenderness. "This lovely being, which is alive to its last recesses and understands every feeling, soothed me. It cured me of my pains, and finally, when I had fully understood my love for it, it taught me freedom." He paused. The silence around us was frightening. The wind hissed softly, and then I heard the distant barking of a lone dog. "Listen to that barking," Don Juan went on. "That is the way my beloved earth is helping me now to bring this last point to you. That barking is the saddest thing one can hear." We were quiet for a moment. The barking of that lone dog was so sad and the stillness around us so intense that I experienced a numbing anguish. It made me think of my own life, my sadness, my not knowing where to go, what to do. "That dog's barking is the nocturnal voice of a man," Don Juan said. "It comes from a house in that valley towards the south. A man is shouting through his dog, since they are companion slaves for life, his sadness, his boredom. He's begging his death to come and release him from the dull and dreary chains of his life." Don Juan's words had caught a most disturbing line in me. I felt he was speaking directly to me. "That barking, and the loneliness it creates, speaks of the feelings of men," he went on. "Men for whom an entire life was like one Sunday afternoon, an afternoon which was not altogether miserable, but rather hot and dull and uncomfortable. They sweated and fussed a great deal. They didn't know where to go, or what to do. That afternoon left them only with the memory of petty annoyances and tedium, and then suddenly it was over, it was already night." He recounted a story I had once told him about a 72-year-old man who complained that his life had been so short that it seemed to him that it was only the day before that he was a boy. The man had said to me, "I remember the pajamas I used to wear when I was 10 years old. It seems that only one day has passed. Where did the time go?" "The antidote that kills that poison is here," Don Juan said, caressing the ground. "The sorcerer's explanation cannot at all liberate the spirit. Look at you two. You have gotten to the sorcerer's explanation, but it doesn't make any difference that you know it. You're more alone than ever, because without an unwavering love for the being that gives you shelter, aloneness is loneliness. Only the love for this splendorous being can give freedom to a warrior's spirit, and freedom is joy, efficiency, and abandon in the face of any odds. That is the last lesson. It is always left for the very last moment, for the moment of ultimate solitude when a man faces his death and his aloneness. Only then does it make sense." Don Juan and Don Genaro stood up and stretched their arms and arched their backs, as if sitting had made their bodies stiff. My heart began to pound fast. They made Pablito and me stand up. "The twilight is the crack between the worlds," Don Juan said. "It is the door to the unknown." He pointed with a sweeping movement of his hand to the mesa where we were standing. This is the plateau in front of that door. He pointed then to the northern edge of the mesa. There is the door. Beyond, there is an abyss, and beyond that abyss is the unknown. Don Juan and Don Genaro then turned to Pablito and said goodbye to him. Pablito's eyes were dilated and fixed, tears were rolling down his cheeks. I heard Don Genaro's voice saying goodbye to me, but I did not hear Don Juan's. Don Juan and Don Genaro moved towards Pablito and whispered briefly in his ears. Then they came to me. But before they had whispered anything, I already had that peculiar feeling of being split. "We will now be like dust on the road," Don Genaro said. "Perhaps it will get in your eyes again, someday." Don Juan and Don Genaro stepped back and seemed to merge with the darkness. Pablito held my forearm and we said goodbye to each other. Then a strange urge, a force, made me run with him to the northern edge of the mesa. I felt his arm holding me as we jumped, and then I was alone. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.